guys, Matt and Bianca here. We will be presenting on Colby Dowdall's Withdrawing from the Nation, Regionalist Literature as Aesthetic Practice in Jewett's The Country of the Pointed Verse. Main claim. So Dowdall is looking at how the novel discusses how literary regionalism, local color, and regionalist literature as a process of being isolated and withdrawing from one's community, which is mirrored in the separation that the narrator makes within the story. How these genres are limited in their goal of sustaining the region as idealized space, local color, and critiquing natural assumptions about these areas, regionalist literature. So these two ideas, we've talked about local color versus regionalist literature, are actually complementary rather than opposites, which many other critics argue. This is shown in Poor Joanna's Isolation, is the union of these two, while the men in this novel are used as regionalist interruptions of local color descriptions. Aestheticism, or self-denial for empowerment, as a way in which the narrative distance is realized, is the tool in which local color and regionalist literature can work together, not opposites but together. So that's the tool. And then it's also being discussed as inclusion and exclusion in terms of citizenship, which emphasizes the connection between descriptions of community in the country and the text's larger critique of the region's place in the national community. So what are we working with and against? So Federally Price's ideas of local color versus regionalist literature is worked with and against. They define local color as commodification of the region by the urban tourist narrator for an urban audience, subordinating the region and its inhabitants, while regionalist literature allows the regional perspectives to resonate alongside that of a narrator. So they're seeing those two things as not working together. Broadhead, Dowdall agrees with to a point. So Broadhead's big thing is outsider versus insider. Dowdall agrees we do need a comparative viewpoint, but thinks that Broadhead is oversimplifying things. It is more complex than that dichotomy, because in order to observe, the narrator has to be included. So what Dowdall is saying is Jewett's narrator is in a place in between. She's in conversation between both worlds, outside and inside, and observes while maintaining necessary distance in order to discuss, compare regions. This is physically shown in the narrator discussing Dunnet Landing from the schoolhouse, local color, looking at, while showing the limitations of within this composition and the nation, which is regionalist, from regional perspectives. Dowdall also works with Jeffrey Galt's Harpum's novel The Aesthetic Imperative in Culture and Its Criticism, that connects aestheticism into this conversation. So what is aestheticism? The narrator's spatial distance is required by the genre to represent the region and mirrors the aesthetic withdrawal of regionalist literature from local color in order to show the limitations of how local color depicts region. So aesthetic, as noted by Jeffrey Galt Harpum, is any act of self-denial undertaken as a strategy of empowerment or gratification. We see this in the novel when the narrator vanishes from the work, which is a moment of self-denial, where you don't really see much of the narrator's ideas, viewpoints, sometimes even physically removing. By writing against the idea that American literature excludes the voices of the marginalized regional voices, these voices are empowered and made visible. Through this aestheticism, local color and regionalist work together, looking at and looking with are existing together in Jewett's work. Harpum uses these scientific terms cenobitic, which is local color, which means the collective group, really no identity, no individual, versus eremitic, regionalist literature, the chief self exists beyond the fringes. Cenobitic is how the region is used to show the American ideal, local color, while eremitic is used to show the artificiality of the American ideal, and seeks to remove the region from the narrative. So then now we're going into how the narrator does this, withdrawing from. So Jewett's narrator constantly returns to the margins of society. We see the return from a yacht trip years before, return from urban spaces, from society to live in Mrs. Todd's cottage, from that cottage to the schoolhouse. Numerous visits to islands and other houses, and physically with removing herself from funeral processions, reunions, and social interactions. Local color seeks to show the problems with this distance. Regionalist literature shows its necessity. And in doing so, the conscious idea of the urban identity falls away while trying to be included. So when the narrator is the closest to being a member of the community, the other identity, the urban identity, is the furthest away. And we see this in the Bowden reunion when she uses our things, our stuff. Another subclaim, the dual representation of poor Joanna. As you mentioned before, Joanna is where we see the union between local color and regionalist. So we get different viewpoints of the same character. Mrs. Fosdick shows her as a sort of nun or hermit person, which is the religious idea of aesthetic. She's a former townsperson who self-exiled after her husband left her. Her choice is filtered to the narrator through the speakers, Mrs. Fosdick and Mrs. Todd, which is the community-centric perspective. Dowdell believes the description of Joanna as removed, hermetical, and a member of shut-up convents all points towards an aesthetic dimension of Dunnett's most isolated citizen. So Joanna's actions are seen as a threat to the survival of the community, by the community itself, while the narrator seems to find her removal a way in which Joanna seeks to find her own identity while being rejected from that community. So the aligning of the narrator and Joanna reveals a mode of representation in which both perspective functions as correctives of each other. So this dual representation that we're getting from different people discloses the complementary relationship between local color and regionalist literature. By introducing Joanna through these aesthetic opposites, the author is using local color to explore regionalist character. These extremes, community versus narrator, are used as correctives to the extremes. So regionalist literature's critique of local color strives to check the latter's exclusion of individual regional voices. However, local color limits regionalist literature's drive towards the individual, the singular and specific, by insisting upon the contextualization of such details within the collective and national narratives. So we have the Dunnett men. The individual male voices of country also function as regionalist interruptions into the narrator's local color rendering of regional space. So each time the narrator's depiction of Dunnett's Landing withdraws from the individual, the specific or the particular, an eccentric male voice is introduced to halt the representation. We see this with Captain Littlepage, Brother William, and Elijah Tilley. So when the narrator is interrupted by William and shown the island, the sudden enlargement of the narrator's vision from the closed circle to the open expanse, that's what we're doing here. So we're going from individual to community. Tilley's pointed interruption of the Bowden reunion is an interruption of harmony as well. He's the most eccentric character. So his withdrawal is rendered physically by his home and by the narrators revealing his utter self-involvement. Tilley breaks from the direct contrast to poor Joanna by not mirroring her aromatic regionalist, but rather blended with Mrs. Blackett's self-forgetfulness. So the narrator and Tilley share their tendency to work both inside and outside, neither completely aromatic nor cenobitic. Aligning the aesthetic and the regional. So narrator inclusion reaches its highest at the Bowden reunion, a return to society. So we had withdrawing from, now we're returning, reunions and pilgrimages. In relation to the busy industry of the mainland, Joanna exists outside of time and history, in eternity, personifying the relationship of region to the nation that local color promotes. The relationship between included and excluded mirrors local color versus regionalist on the stature of rural views urban as idealized American space. So each successive pilgrimage to Joanna's shrine represents the urban reader's journey away from urban America that local color implicitly opposes. However, with each pilgrimage, the story of Joanna's aesthetic retreat is retold in that deprive her of individual voice. And bringing together the generic tendencies of both local color and regionalist, this text announces the inextricability of region from nation. So Dowdell is engaging with Broadhead's arguments about audience and contemporary readers' expectation of their place of privilege with the narrator. Our observations. We found the connection between two seemingly opposite ideas, local color versus regionalist, as thoroughly explored and expanded upon. And we really like the scientific metaphor of cenobitic versus aromatic, which makes it more real and less theoretical because it's kind of scientific. And then we have a quote at the very end. Rather than Broadhead's reduction of regionalist literature as exclusively complicit with the nationalist assumption, or their federally separation of regionalist literature's critical and compliant elements into regionalist literature and local color, the richness of literary regionalism resides in the inextricable relationship between region and nation. It's a great conclusion that we feel sums up the complex nature of Jewett's narrator that seems to fit in and not. A desire to be an honored exile, but in a way that we have not read before, which is more muddled and definitely more positive than Mary Austin's work, which has a looking in, looking at struggle. The pilgrimages the narrator takes to see Joanna and Brother William create physical distance between two compelling literary genres, while Captain Littlepage and Elijah Tilley echo these pilgrimages to reach the narrator. By physically and spatially divorcing the genres in her work, Jewett creates a pathway between the two. Dowdall makes compelling arguments to their Semitic and Aramaic origins, but the work itself does well to harness the fertile conflict between the forces on her narrator. However, we do feel like this connection between widows and outsiders is slightly glossed over and would have liked to have read more about it. Hope this helped you guys. Stay safe out there.